Have you ever been out on a run and looked over at a trail you never taken and thought, I wonder where that goes? I get that feeling all the time. And honestly, it doesn't even matter if there's a waterfall at the end or just another mile of dirt. Something in me just wants to know what's over the next ridge. Now this week, I fell down one of those late night documentary rabbit holes about America's last 250 years, and I noticed something I hadn't thought about before. Every major chapter in our country's history has one thing quietly happening in the background. Somebody's running. Not for a medal, not for Strava, and not because Garmin told them to. They were running because it mattered. To deliver a message, to explore, to survive, to discover what was waiting beyond the horizon. And it made me realize, maybe running isn't really a new sport at all. Maybe every time we leave the pavement and head into the wilderness, we're reconnecting with one of America's oldest instincts. So today, let's go for a run through 250 years of American history, 1 mile at a time. Cue that intro music.
Who says you need to fly to reach the top? Keep beating your block till your feet are hot. Get your head out the sand, join the flock. It's okay to run scared, we enjoy
Welcome back to the Ostrich Running Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Meraz. And today, I'm sitting in this chair, recording this, and I'm thinking all the places that running has taken me so far. But I can't help to think of all the places I've yet to run. I feel like there are so many spots locally that I have yet to explore, and curiosity has just hit me hard today because I want to know what else is out there. That's the whole thought. That's it. I wonder what's out there. You could say there's nothing over there for me, no aid station, no cool overlook, just more trails like the ones I've been running, but I know that's a lie. Something in me wants to go find out. And it wasn't the part of me that signs up for races or reads training plans. I think it's something older than that. Now, I've been chasing that feeling basically my whole life without really having a name for it. And then, this is kind of a funny story actually. I was down a rabbit hole recently for something totally unrelated, just watching these documentaries about America in the last 250 years, over and over, episode after episode. In every era of American history, there's somebody running, not running like a marathon, but running because they had to, running because it mattered. And I really can't stop thinking about it. So here's what today's episode is. It's not a lecture, I promise. You know me, I'm not about to sit here and read you dates off a page. This is really just a story. It's the story of this country, roughly 250 years of it. And the whole time, kind of quietly in the background, there's running happening. Before it was a hobby, before it was something people did for fun, on a Saturday morning with the podcast in their ears, it was survival. It was how people got somewhere. It was how a warning got from one place to another before there was anything faster than the human leg to carry it. And the thing that actually got me, the thing that made me want to make this episode instead of just, filing it away as a fun fact, when we go run trails now, when we drive an hour to go suffer voluntarily on some mountain, we are, and I mean this actually literally, not just in some metaphor type of way. We are running the same ground, same ridge lines, same river crossings, stuff that used to have real stakes attached to it. People used to cross these exact terrains because their life depended on it, or because they were trying to warn somebody, or because there wasn't a road yet, and their legs were the only option that they had. And now we do it because it's just Tuesday and we felt like it. I don't think trail running is really a new sport if you think about it that way. I think it's kind of an old instinct that just found new shoes. All right, so let's go back, way back, before the 13 colonies, before any of this was America in the way we think about it now. Long before anybody with a musket showed up on a boat, the people who already lived here had figured out something about the human body that I think we're still catching up to. Now, among the Hopi, other Pueblo communities, the Apache, long distance running was not a hobby. It wasn't fitness. It was infrastructure. Like the way we think about roads or cell towers. If a village needed to get word to another village 40 miles away across a brutal desert terrain, somebody ran it. That was the system. And these runners trained that from the time they were kids. This wasn't a random guy who happened to be fast. This was a role in the community. Something you were raised into. There's also this thing called persistence hunting. And I know I've mentioned it on previous episodes, but it's been documented across a bunch of different indigenous groups on this continent. And I love this one because it's basically the origin of ultras. You're not going to out-sprint a deer. Nobody's out-sprinting a deer. But you can outlast one. You track it. You keep pressure on it. You don't let it fully rest. And eventually, hours later, sometimes most of a day later, its body just gives out before yours does. And that's not me being poetic. That's the real hunting method. That might be the oldest endurance event on this continent, and it predates race bibs by, I don't know, by a lot. And I think about that on like mile 70 of something I probably shouldn't have signed up for. There's a version of this, and I don't want to say it's in my DNA because I'm not a geneticist. I don't actually know that, but I know that there's something in us, all of us, that already knows how to keep moving after it stops being fun. We didn't invent that feeling. We're just kind of remembering it, I guess. Oh, and it wasn't only about survival either. That's the other thing. Running had a spiritual weight in a lot of these communities too. Connection to the land, to each other. Stuff that I think a lot of the settlers who showed up later just didn't have a framework for. So they either ignored it or flattened it into something smaller than it was. Which, yeah, there's a lot buried under that sentence that we don't have time to fully get into today, but I didn't want to skip that past either. You know, I think we feel a lot of this stuff when we do these runs, the spiritual connection. Anyway, I run with a GPS watch, water flask, a screenshot of a course map on my phone, and I still somehow end up in the wrong spot. More often than I'd like to admit, actually. Somewhere the ghosts of people who ran this exact terrain from memory alone are rolling in their grave because of that. Okay, so let's fast forward. And let's bring it to the tension of the 60s and 70s. Not the cool hippie times, but I'm talking about the 1700 times, where a bunch of guys in wool coats yelling about tea, and eventually that boils over into a war. And here's something that doesn't get talked about enough. The Revolutionary War, in a very real way, got decided on foot. Now, you know Paul Revere. Everybody knows Paul Revere. The Midnight Ride. The British are coming. The British are coming. 1 if by land, 2 if by water. It's a great story. Except, and this is the part that is really interesting, Revere never actually finished the ride. Got captured before he made it to Concord. The guy who actually got the warning through was a doctor named Samuel Prescott, who wasn't even supposed to be part of this. He was riding home from seeing a woman he was courting. Then somehow he ran into Revere and William Dawes on the road and tagged along. And when the British patrol stopped them, Prescott, the one who knew the back roads well enough, probably to get away from the woman's other men, he broke off and made it. Now, I like that so much more than the version we all learned in school because the mission didn't hinge on one legendary guy. It hinged on whoever was still standing. Whoever knew the land well enough to keep moving once the plan fell apart. Which, yeah, that's every ultra I've ever run. Nobody's race goes according to plan. The question is just who's still moving when it doesn't. And it wasn't just messengers either. George Washington's army did an insane amount of marching. Christmas night in 1776, they crossed the Delaware, which everyone's seen the painting of. But people forget that the crossing was just one step. After that, they still marched 9 miles through sleet, in the dark, and a lot of them with rags for boots. Some of them leaving blood in the snow to hit Trenton before dawn. That's a rough taper week, is all I'm saying. Now compare that to me getting mildly annoyed if my pre-race breakfast burrito isn't exactly right. And then there's the lesser known one from a few years later, 1781, that I think about a lot. General Nathaniel Greene being chased through the Carolinas by Cornwallis, who's got the bigger, better supplied army. Greene's guys are exhausted, outnumbered, basically out of good options. So he does this thing that's still studied at military academies, which is he runs on purpose, strategically. It's called the Race to the Dan. Basically 200 miles of Carolina backcountry, dead of winter, freezing rain, flooded creeks, some of his men with no shoes at all racing to get across the Dan River into Virginia before Cornwallis catches them. And they made it. Crossed the river, pulled the boats to the far side, and Cornwallis shows up just a little bit too late. Now, Greene never actually beat Cornwallis in a straight-up fight. If you look at the record, not once. But by refusing to stop moving, by outlasting an army that had every material advantage over his, he wore Cornwallis down. Enough that it set up everything that led to Yorktown later. And honestly, sometimes the win isn't winning the fight in front of you. Sometimes the win is just staying in the fight long enough for the thing to turn. And that's huge. We need to do that in all of our races. Kind of see where I'm going with this? Now, I was in the Navy, and I've mentioned this before. You've heard it on the show, and most of what I actually learned wasn't some dramatic combat thing. It was monotony. Standing a watch at 3 a.m. when your whole body is begging you to lie down. Doing boring, unglamorous stuff nobody's ever going to see or care about. Over and over because it needs doing. Now, Greene's army wasn't glamorous either. It was cold and wet and hungry. And it just kept moving anyway. And I think that's most of what endurance actually looks like. It's not the summit. It's the 10,000 steps nobody's filming. Okay, so war's over. Country exists now. So now what? Now America starts looking west, starts asking that same ridge question, except this time it's asking it about an entire continent nobody's mapped yet. The year 1804. Lewis and Clark set out, and everybody pictures that as a boat trip, which, fair, a lot of it was on the river, but a huge chunk of it happened off the boats, on foot, scouting ahead, hunting, figuring out terrain nobody from back east had ever seen. And there's this guy, John Colter, who's been a part of that expedition and just stayed out west after as a trapper. And around 1808, he gets captured by a group of Blackfeet Indians. And the story goes, instead of just killing him, they strip him down and give him a head start. They turn it into a hunt, and Colter runs for his life miles of Wyoming terrain barefoot, bleeding, and somehow outruns all but one guy chasing him. He deals with that last one, and then he hides underwater, breathing through a hollow reed until the search parties give up. And then he still has to walk 200 miles back to the nearest trading post, alone, injured, basically starving. No trail, no drop bag, no GPS watch beeping at him. Just don't stop or you die. And we run through country that looks a lot like that now, with 2 flasks and gels in my vest, and get mad about a rock in my shoe. Which, I want to be clear, I'm not saying that to shame myself or you or anybody who's ever complained about a blister. I'm just saying it's funny how far the bar has moved. That's all. Now, the mountain men who came after him lived some version of that for years at a stretch. On foot, horseback, trapping beaver, trading with different indigenous nations, surviving winters that would probably kill most of us in a long weekend. Once a year, a lot of them would gather at this thing called a rendezvous where they would trade furs, restock supplies, remember what other humans sounded like, and then disappear back into the wilderness for another 11 months. And honestly, that's basically a race expo, right? All of us scattered, doing our own solo training in the dark for months. Then once or twice a year, we all show up in the same dusty parking lot to swap stories and compare gear before going back into it. Different century. Same instinct. Then come the wagons, the Oregon Trail. You have died from cholera. Starting in the 1840s, hundreds of thousands of people crossing about 2,000 miles of plains, mountain, desert. And here's the detail that always throws people. Most of the pioneers weren't riding in the wagons. The wagons were full of supplies and people walked. Families walked basically the whole 2,000 miles. Wore through multiple pairs of shoes, crossed rivers on foot, climbed South Pass, no aid stations, obviously. If a wheel broke, you fixed it yourself or you fell behind. If you got sick, sometimes the whole group had to make a call about whether to wait for you or keep moving. Because winter in the mountains does not care about your feelings. Something like 1 in 10 people who set out on that trail didn't make it. Cholera mostly. From bad water. And they kept going anyway. Year after year, train after train. And I think about that every time I catch myself grumbling about a rocky descent, making my quads angry. I've got a headlamp. I've got more calories in a vest than some of those families even saw in a week. I get to choose this. That's not nothing, by the way. I actually think that's kind of the whole point. But we'll get there. The year 1860. Now, this is one of my favorite little pieces of this whole thing. The Pony Express shows up. And I know it's horses, not runners, but please, just stay with me. I have a purpose here. The system wasn't one rider going the whole way. It was a relay. Riders going flat out for 70, 80, 100 miles, swapping horses every 10 or 15 at these little stations along the route, then handing the mail to the next guy. Whole system moved messages almost 2,000 miles, Missouri to California in about 10 days, which in 1860 is basically teleportation, right? Beam me up, Scotty. It's horses. Now, I said that already, but structurally, what is that? That's an aid station. That's a crew handoff. That's literally what happens when my wife takes a headlamp off me at mile 70 and hands me a dry shirt because she already knows what I need before I ask. Now, the Pony Express figured out something that we still build our entire sport around 160 years later. Nobody covers that kind of distance alone. You need people showing up for their leg of it. Now, that didn't last long, by the way, because The telegraph made it obsolete in about 18 months. But during the Civil War that followed, when telegraph lines got cut or just hadn't been strung somewhere yet, runners, they still mattered. Dispatch runners moving between units, sometimes under fire. Because a battle, well, it could turn on whether a message got there in 5 minutes or 15. And you know what? Nobody remembers those guys' names. There's no statue for the guy who ran 2 miles across open ground because the colonel needed to know that the flank had collapsed. But the outcome of that day probably depended on him more than it depended on anybody with stars on their collar. I think we romanticize the wrong parts of history sometimes. We remember the generals. We don't remember the legs. Okay. And then something shifts. For basically the first 200 years of this, wilderness is mostly an obstacle. Something you cross, something you survive, something you clear and settle. And then, in 1872, the country creates Yellowstone, the first national park in the world. And the whole idea is, don't use this land, protect it. Which was a crazy new thought at the time. And there's a guy named John Muir who spent years just relentlessly advocating for places like Yosemite, walking those mountains obsessively, writing about them in the way that made people actually care. And then you got Roosevelt, who, well, there's a funny story here actually, was a sickly kid, bad asthma, doctors telling him to take it easy his whole childhood, and his response was basically, no thanks. And he built himself into one of the toughest guys of his generation through sheer stubbornness. Boxing, ranching out in the Dakota Badlands after he lost his wife and his mother on the same day in the same house, which I can't imagine that grief. And apparently he processed a lot of it by going out west and working himself half to death on a ranch. I'm not saying that's healthy necessarily. I'm definitely not a therapist, but I get the impulse. There have been plenty of days where the only thing that got my head straight was just putting one foot in front of the other until it cleared. Now, Roosevelt ends up protecting something like 230 million acres as president. He gave a speech in 1899 called The Strenuous Life, basically arguing comfort was making people soft, and a real life involves choosing difficulty on purpose. I won't pretend the guy was perfect. He wasn't. That's a whole nother conversation. But that one idea, difficulty on purpose, has value. That's basically the entire unspoken religion of trail running, whether anyone's actually read the speech or not. Crazy, right? And the thing about all of these parks and forests that got protected around then, every trail we run for fun now exists because somebody over a century ago fought to keep that land wild on purpose. So every time you're grinding up a switchback, you're running through somebody's argument, somebody won that fight so that generations later, complete strangers could go suffer on it voluntarily. Running starts formalizing into an actual sport around this time. The Boston Marathon, 1897, inspired by the marathon at the 1896 Athens Olympics. Stayed pretty niche for decades, mostly men running it, until Catherine Switzer registers under her initials in 1967 and runs the whole course with an official literally trying to physically rip her bib off mid-race. And women weren't officially allowed into Boston until 1972. She didn't just finish a marathon that day. She ran through a door that had been nailed shut, and it stayed open. Then the 70s hit. And I don't think you can overstate this one, but 1972, Frank Shorter wins the Olympic gold in marathon, the first American to do it in like 60 years. And this ordinary looking dude from Colorado outlasting the best in the world on TV in people's living rooms, that basically sets off the whole running boom. Suddenly regular people who've never thought of themselves as athletes are out jogging around the block. Bill Rogers becomes this everyman face of it, winning Boston and New York over and over. And don't get me started on Prefontaine. He's out in Oregon just refusing to hold anything back, ever, which becomes part of the DNA of a shoe company his coach helped start. Maybe you've heard of it. Just do it. And running stops being a serious athlete thing and just becomes a thing people do before work because it makes them feel more alive. That's it. That's the whole shift. And then, sort of by accident, honestly, ultra running is born out here in California. And I know there's been races before, ultra races, but, getting very popular. There's this horse race called the Tevis Cup, 100 miles through Sierra Nevada, 1974. A guy named Gordy Ainsley is supposed to ride it. And the story goes that his horse is lame, so he decides, I'm just going to run the same 100 miles on foot. Finishes in under 24 hours. And that run is basically credited as the spark that leads a few years later to Western States, which is more or less the race that wrote the rule book for the entire sport. And that's the whole origin story of an entire sport people build their identities around. And because I think about this stuff often, right? Because that's like kind of the whole philosophy behind ostrich running, whether I meant it to be or not. The plan falls apart, you run it anyway. Now, I've DNF'd races, cramped so bad at that last O'Neill Park 50K that I generally thought was over, watching people I'd been running with for hours just cruise on past while I frantically tried to figure out what I'd done wrong with my sodium. That's how a lot of the good stuff starts. Not with a plan, but with something going wrong badly enough that you decide to fix it. Kodiak 100, I finished that one completely wrecked and completely proud at the same time, which is a weird combination that I don't think makes sense to anybody who hasn't done one of these. San Diego 50 miler where I got lost, standing at that start line more scared than I expected to be, honestly, because the distance never gets less honest about who you are that day. It doesn't matter how many times you've done it. There was a stretch of my life, and I've talked about this before, where I wasn't really running toward anything. I was mostly just trying to outrun myself. Drinking, using drugs, was tangled up in all of that. Getting sober didn't happen because of running. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't that clean of a story. But running became one of those places I actually learned to sit with something uncomfortable instead of trying to immediately escape it. 1 mile at a time. And that turned out to be a skill I needed pretty much everywhere else too. I don't think that makes me special. I think that's a big part of why a lot of us end up out here at 5 a.m. choosing to hurt on purpose. Sometimes the pain you pick is a lot healthier than the pain that picks you. And now, I'm training for the Route 66 Ultra Run, 140 miles, Seligman, Arizona to Topak 66, chasing a PR distance finish. I've talked about the next aid station rule on the show before. You don't have to solve the whole race in your head at mile 10. You just have to get to the next aid station. And then the one after that. Now, working on this episode, I realized I didn't actually invent that. Pony Express riders lived by that rule. Nathaniel Greene's army lived by that rule. You don't survive 200 miles to the Dan River all at once in your head. You just make it to the next crossing. Now, modern trail running's a weird contradiction if you actually sit with it. It's entirely optional. Nobody's chasing us with a musket. Nothing bad happens if we don't make it over the ridge, and we still choose to suffer on purpose. On the same ground that used to demand it out of necessity. We start in the dark. We climb passes settlers used to dread. We run canyons mountain men cross terrified and alone. And we do it because some part of us still needs to know what's over there. Even when there's nothing over there. Even when we already know that logically and go anyway. That question, what else is out there? I don't think that's really a hiking question. I think it might be the most American question there is. It's the question that put people on boats across an ocean. It's the question that pushed families 2,000 miles across open plains on foot. It's the question that had John Colter running barefoot through rough terrain rather than accepting the ending somebody else picked for him. And in a much smaller version, safer version, it's the same question that gets me off a paved road and onto a trail I've never run, even when I've already got a perfectly fine route mapped here at home. We're all small inheritors of a bigger curiosity. We didn't invent the itch to leave the known path. We just get to scratch it recreationally now, with better shoes and a lot less risk of actually dying out there. So here's what I want to leave this, because I said up front, this wasn't going to turn into some flag waving thing. And I meant that. I'm not trying to wrap this up with some crazy fireworks. What I actually think after living inside this history the past week, I think this country's always been defined by movement. Not because moving was ever easy. It wasn't. For anybody not for a family walking 2,000 miles with everything that they own behind them in a wagon, not for a soldier marching through frozen mud with rags for boots, not for a runner covering 40 miles of desert to warn a village something was coming. None of that was easy, but it was hope. Just the physical act of believing something better existed somewhere you hadn't been yet and being willing to hurt a little to go find out. And I don't think that hope belonged only to the people who ended up in the history books either. It belonged just as much to some runner nobody ever wrote down the name of, carrying a word between two villages 1,000 years ago, as it did to Washington's army, as it did to a scared kid joining the Navy because he needed his life to go somewhere different than where it was headed. Hope's usually not loud. Most of the time, it just looks like somebody deciding to take one more step than they strictly had to. So next time you go out for a trail run, tomorrow, this weekend, now, currently on it, whenever your legs are actually ready again, maybe think about that for a second before you hit start on your watch. You're not just going for a workout. You're not just chasing a Strava segment. You're doing something a lot older than that, whether you meant to or not. Leaving what's comfortable to go see what's past the horizon. That's not a new idea. That might be the oldest idea we've got. It was here before there was a flag, before this place even had a name. And every time you pick the dirt path over the paved one, every time you look at a ridge and just have to know what's on the other side of it, you're not doing something new. You're doing something really old. You're just doing it in trail shoes. Now, go find your ridge. Maybe I'll see you out there. Thank you for listening. Cue that outro music.
Who says you need to fly to reach the top? Keep beating your block till your feet are hot. Get your head out the sand, join the flock. It's okay to run scared, we enjoy the lie. I'm a nod, kid, like an ostrich. I got a pod, kids, here's a topic. Blaze your own trail, don't be cautious. 2 birds, 1 stone's how I rock it. Can't make an omelet without breaking a shell. But they say grew up, now I'm raising hell. Haters gonna hate, yeah, they pray and you fail. So put in the work, whether pavement or trail. The grades fell down, but they got to their feet. Run your own race, put this pod on repeat. Shake your tail feather, keep nodding your beaks. Ostrich gang, or you're not my peeps.